the CEO of oh there now it's really happening. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Matthew Rowe. I'm the CEO of the Campaign for Wool here in Canada and its parent organization, the Canadian Wool Council. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the campaign and the work of the Wool Council, this is our 9th year of operation here in Canada. We were launched in 2014 on a windy pier in Pictou, Nova Scotia, by their now Majesties, the King and Queen, then the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall. And the campaign was started by His Majesty, then the Prince of Wales, when he saw a landscape where farmers were struggling to get paid a good price for their clip, where he saw consumers were sort of forgetting about the wonders of wool as this multi-purpose natural fiber, and saw this at the same time, the environmental challenges posed by climate change, as well as the vast increase in the use of synthetic fibers, particularly in terms of clothing, and the effects that has on our water systems, filling up our oceans with microplastics and things like that. So again, he thought the time was right to really empower the wool industry to take advantage of this sort of special moment in history, to revitalize what has been something that's been a constant in human civilization from the very beginning. Sheep were the first animals that were domesticated after dogs, and they've been great sources of meat, fiber, and dairy for us for 10,000 years. So our goal with the campaign in Canada and the Canadian Wool Council is to really look at creating opportunities for telling the story about how amazing wool is, for promoting wool to consumers and educating them on the wonders of wool, but also specifically to develop opportunities for Canadian wool, as well as Alberta wool, included in that group, and the Canadians and Albertans who transform it. So that work over the last few years has really coalesced around our wool plan. If you haven't read it yet, it's available on our website. I'll pop a link in the chat shortly. But it's good bedtime reading if you haven't read it. But it really looks at what are the major barriers that are holding back the Canadian wool industry, and how can we tackle them. And over the last few years, we've gone about that in a number of different ways. We've put together export plans looking at first carpets, and now we've got one coming out very shortly on upholstery. We'll have another webinar on that soon. We've created branded content to share with producers and manufacturers and retailers who sell Canadian wool products, talking about the wonders of wool. Again, professional hand tags, postcards, info sheets, both digital and printed materials, to be able to help again in that quest to educate the consumer on the wonders of wool and why they should be choosing wool in all of their fabric purchases. We've also been looking at how we rebrand and revalue Canadian wool around a cohesive national brand, and really trying to use the landscape, our very strong regulatory framework in terms of animal welfare, and really the history and the story of Canada and Canadians from coast to coast to coast, to really position Canadian wool as a premium product and one that's worth paying more for. Part of our work has also been about linking us to the world. And so one of the early achievements in that front was securing Canada's first ever seat at the International Wool Textile Organization, which is the global governing body for the wool trade. And I'm going to get into it a little bit at the end of my presentation, because we have some great opportunities for Alberta producers to get involved with that work specifically. And this is a real chance to learn from the global community where we were really absent. The organization's existed for 90 years. It has a membership that includes all of the major wool producing countries, including China, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. But for some reason, Canada was one of the only wool producing countries that wasn't at the table. So we've remedied that, and we've got some great opportunities for you there. I'm here today, though, to talk to you specifically about the shearing plan. And this was really outlined in our wool plan as one of the barriers, and it addresses a need for trying to come up with a framework for how we recruit, train, accredit shearers. So I'm just going to show our plan here. This is available on our website at campaignforwool.ca. But again, it's a very comprehensive plan. I want to start off, though, by specifically thanking the members of our shearing circle. The report, our author, Jane Underhill, who couldn't be with us today because she's actually having another town hall with our shearers at the same time. But she really assembled a crackerjack group of shearing experts and really the master practitioners from all across Canada. And I'm sure there's some that we missed, but we have a pretty representative group of those who are seen as kind of the top of their profession. These include Sarah Nettleton from Nova Scotia, Fiona Breckenridge from Nova Scotia and New Zealand, Amber Peterson from Prince Edward Island, Don Metherell from Ontario, Ruko Bratt from Ontario, Jenny Carnahan from Ontario, Russell Eddy from Manitoba, Dr. Lisa Serber from Alberta, as well as the United States, Alex Baker from Alberta, and Peter Demoy from British Columbia. And it's important to say that we went into this work with no preconceptions about what would come out the other end. We knew sort of high level what needed to be done, but we also knew that it had to be driven for shearers and by shearers. So we provided the resources and the forum, but everything you see in this plan is a product of those shearer discussions. And then that's included not just the circle who've worked most closely on it, but also a much wider group of shearers who've had input into this process and have really helped to shape this. So I won't get into sort of all the specifics. Again, it makes for good bedtime reading. But what we do is we look at our current shearing model, which is fairly lackadaisical, and then we really benchmark against some of the other leading countries and see where are some of the lessons that we can learn, and in terms of how we structure this industry. So the result is this plan, which proposes and outlines the structure for a potential national organization that would be shearer-led and would provide a variety of services around shearing training, producer education, wool handling, and that would also include, as I said, testing and accreditation, but would also include an opportunity to provide the profession with services for shearers across the country. Things like insurance, access to cheaper cost equipment, that sort of thing. The sorts of being able to have a unified voice to speak to government. These are all things that are very important, as we learned over the course of the research, in being able to have an effective shearing organization and a respected shearing accreditation. Some of the other opportunities that this plan looks at are things like work experience and work exchange. And again, that's where our international connections really come in handy. But as well, in terms of how we recruit, how we showcase that work through competitions, and all of the other supports that the profession needs in order to be successful. So again, you can go through this on your own time. I'm just going to sort of quickly run through the plan here, but that in short is what we've looked at, to be able to empower shearers to really take their profession to the next level. Because like a lot of things with regards to wool in this country, there hasn't been a lot of investment over the past few decades. And so this plan was an opportunity for us to, put our money where our mouth was, in terms of we wanted to do something about shearing. So we raised the money and we gave it to the shearers to be able to run this process and provide them with the support to write this plan. The plan is very much a work in progress. As I said, there was no sort of preconceived outcome. And in fact, as I say, at this very moment, there's shearers across the country involved with it, are looking at that next steps of what a national shearing organization could look like. What are some of the early projects that they want to take on? Who will they work with? Again, we've offered to support this work, and even if they would like us to provide some of the administrative support, but it's totally up to them. And one thing that we've learned throughout this process is, again, that's something that's very important to shearers. I think it's very important, certainly if we were doing anything around that was directly concerning producers. We know that producers would want to be in the driver's seat as well. So it's like with any aspect of the Canadian wool value chain, people want to be able to be in control. So we've, as I say, provided that structure, but we've also, and the resources to explore it, as well as the relationships that we hold with other Campaign for Wool countries, the 13 different countries around the world where the campaign runs, as well as other member nations of the IWTO, and then have given it to the shearers to run with it and see what they can achieve. This is, of course, we're entering into the busy season for shearers. So again, they're conscious of that, but no one's in a rush to sort of do anything rash. Everyone wants to be sure that they're moving and acting systematically, and that they're working with the widest possible group of shearers as possible. This isn't this sort of structure isn't going to be for everyone, and it's not mandated to be for everyone. But there's enough of an interest and a desire amongst what I would call sort of the movable middle of the profession. I mean, we have those who recognize the need right off the bat. I mean, some of those are on the advisory council, and that's why they're there, because they're often people who've worked internationally and have seen the need for, well, I've seen the value, I should say, for having some sort of overall structure for the profession in this country. And so we are in the process right now of sort of building that coalition of the willing, and the Canadian Wool Council and the campaign is here to support it. But I think I would take this plan in the context of our wider effort to really address some of the systemic barriers that the industry has faced, and also to position ourselves for success. Because if we don't have good shearers, if we don't have good access to shearing, we're not going to have a good wool product. And our efforts to brand it at the other end, and to develop 100% Canadian wool products that are going to leverage that national brand, that'll all mean nothing if we can't deliver a quality product. And of course, to do that, we need the producers, but we need the shearers to be able to harvest. So I would say stay tuned in terms of where this is going to go. But the plan itself is really just another aspect of the key infrastructure of the industry that we've taken on to be able to address, and to because again, previous efforts have been much more scattered. I think our strategic plan has been the first time that we've really looked at this holistically, and looked at it again from producer to consumer. And I think that's where some of the approaches in the past have lacked, in that they've only looked at one aspect of the value chain, whether they be the producer, the manufacturer, the shearer, but they haven't looked at the whole picture. And so this plan fits into are this wider effort to leverage the entire value chain to be able to identify and then execute on high value added opportunities for Canadian wool. And some of those I mentioned before, where we see good opportunity for Canadian wool, like with carpet, like with upholstery. We have actually a partnership we've developed with a Vancouver-based company where we're looking at this year small scale Canadian wool production, but they're very keen to ramp it up to large scale broadloom production, which would be very exciting and which would instantly require a very large amount of the Canadian wool clip. So we're very excited about those opportunities. Another area where we're really interested in exploring is Alberta, of course, is home to a lot of the country's fine wool flock. And so trying to be able to connect that and get that processed and transformed in a way that it can be used by designers, manufacturers in other parts of the country. We have no shortage of people who are interested in getting a fine wool Canadian yarn. The challenge is getting the quantity and the quality needed to fulfill commercial and industrial goals or requirements. But the fact is that we're working on it and hoping to identify those opportunities as we go forward. So again, I wanted the point of this conversation to really be just to highlight what we had accomplished here with the Shearing plan. But I really want to be driven by your questions and also, if we can save a little time at the end after we've exhausted on Shearing, I'd love to talk a little bit more about some specific opportunities we have for Alberta producers to feed into our international work and our national policy work and standards work, because we would really benefit from that. But without droning on too long, I'd like to pause and perhaps open it up to questions about the Shearing plan, the work of the Campaign for Wool in Canada, and how we can better provide opportunities for Alberta producers. So over to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Matthew. If there are questions from the group, if you want, because it's a more intimate group here on Zoom this evening, feel free to unmute yourself rather than using the chat box, and then Matthew can help answer your questions.
And you don't have to, but if you turn on your camera, it's always nice to see people, especially since there's so few of us. But not a requirement.
Don't be shy. Someone has to ask the first question.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for putting on this webinar this evening. I guess my first question would be, how well do you see the Shearing plan being received overall by shearers and producers? Like, obviously, this is something that I do personally think will be successful, but I'm wondering how successful, because I was actually raised by a shearing family. My mom sheared sheep for 50 plus years. And
Wow.
Knowing a lot of sheep shearers through my life, they can be kind of a stubborn lot. So I'm just curious, the old school guys, are you seeing interest in that? Or do you think that they'll just continue doing their thing the way they have been for years and years?
Yeah, really great question. I mean, I would say kind of a resistance to change is not specific to shearers. we see it across the industry, but that's part of our challenge is to alleviate some of those fears, but also not be held hostage by them. So I would say that the plan has been very well received by I would say a majority of the shearers and the producers that we've been dealing with. There are, certainly a vocal minority that don't want anything to do with it, and that are sort of the ilk that you suggest, who want to just sort of do their own thing. And I guess there was some misunderstanding over what, I think because we have the king on the masthead, some people think that we act with the authority of government, and that's certainly not the case. We are, we raise our own money, we do our own work, and we work with people who want to work with us. So if for those who want to continue doing the status quo, there'll be no compulsion. There's no requirement to join along with this. Where I think you are seeing the understanding and the driving of this initiative is from those shearers who, especially those shearers who work not only in Canada, but work internationally, because they see that the really successful countries, when you're looking at countries like Australia, New Zealand, the UK, South Africa, they all have formal structures to train, accredit, and access shearing. And so I think the Canadians who have been exposed to those systems see the value. I think because, again, our industry, quite frankly, we've been through a lot, particularly for the last few decades. And so I think there is a natural reticence to take on anything new. But our job is to see, who are the people we can work with, what can be done, and how can we advance the profession. So I really see the potential for it. But again, the fate of it ultimately is in the hands of shearers. And so, but I think, and based on, the early, the work that's being done, as I say, right now with some of that advisory group, it looks like that there is, a group that is looking to drive this forward. And I'm proud to say that group is representative of the people who would be, by many called sort of the master shearers in Canada. So as I say, we're all about building a coalition of the willing, but it's not an easy path, and the solutions aren't easy. And if they were, that they would have been done already. But I think what's important is that we've started the conversation. I think there's those who would not want the conversation to happen at all, but we take a different tact. We believe that we've got a lot of excellence in the sector. The point of this exercise is to just help to standardize that, help to increase access to quality training, help to ensure that there is, a standard in terms of testing and accreditation. And then also for the industry to find its voice, and for the profession to find its voice as a national industry, not just as individual people competing against each other. I think the best sort of example for that is with the Campaign for Wool itself. The Campaign for Wool, again, the global wool industry can be very fractious. Again, it's a very old industry, a lot of competing nations. But what's really cool about the campaign is it brings together the global industry, who in theory are competitors, but recognize that because wool is only 1% of the wool textile of the global textile trade, we need to work together in order to educate consumers, to drive demand, and to also to supply that demand. There is some, there's different countries that do better with different kinds of wool, and there's different niches to be had, but there's enough business for us all, and there's enough opportunity that we know that by working together, we can lift all boats. And so the shearing plan is sort of in that vein, but it's part of this larger effort of the campaign. I mean, the example I always use is that the Campaign for Wool, for most of our history in Canada, one of our biggest supporters has been the Global Campaign for Wool, which in turn is funded by the global industry, which, on first glance seems unusual that, you would have basically competing industries supporting work here in Canada, but it's because they recognize the value of Canadians better understanding wool benefits the entire global wool industry, but also having a vibrant wool industry in Canada can only be good for the global industry. So I hope that helps to answer your question. I know I went on a bit of a tangent there, but it's it's certainly not a consensus based, but I would say that we definitely have the majority, and certainly the majority of those with international experience.
Okay, that does make quite a bit of sense. I do actually have a second question for you. How would the shearing plan and putting together a national shearing network affect producers? Would this help, in theory, the producers that are struggling to find shearers that are able to come do their flocks? I know we have a lot of shearers in Alberta, but it's a constant thing where, you see these producers on Facebook or other social media sites that are struggling to get a shearer out to their place. And they're actually, maybe they've got a small flock, or honestly, some people that I've talked to, it's not even just a small flock. They've got a decent number, maybe not a couple hundred head, but certainly enough that it would make make it worthwhile for a shearer to come out, and they still have trouble getting someone out there. So would this have a beneficial impact to those producers, or just how would it affect producers in general?
Yeah, very good question. And the short answer is yes. By having a structure like this, the point is that it makes it easier to have to recruit, to promote the profession, as an option, to connect shearers from across the country with opportunities in areas outside of their home region, and critically also to connect them with the global industry. So being able to, so for shearers who really want to make a go of it, and turn it into a year-round career, being able to do full seasons in Canada and then turn around and go to the Southern Hemisphere and do it all over again, in New Zealand or Australia, South Africa. These are this good for the shearer, and it's good for our global partners too, because they need shearers as well. But it's also good for the profession, because you're creating a pathway, because again, not everyone has who might be a good shearer has had the good fortune of being born to good shearers. You're lucky in that regard. But again, the majority of Canadians don't live in rural areas, but that doesn't mean that they're not suited to rural careers. And so we think by having more of a formalized structure for shearing, it'll make it more attractive, and make it easier for the profession to get both provincial and government funding and federal funding, to be able to support training and recruitment efforts, but which is very important in terms of financial viability, but also in terms of looking at how producers can better access that membership. One of the really cool things that came out of it was hearing from South Africa, for example, where they have an app where you can go on and you can book a shearer. You can look at all the different shearers, look at their qualifications, look at their ratings from other producers, and book it all through that app. So you could never do that with one or two. I mean, you could, but it'd be very expensive, and the bandwidth would be limited by the ability of those one or two people to do that. This having a national organization gives you the opportunity to take on a project like that. Yeah, so I hope that helps make sense. I mean, that was really the impetus for this work, comes from the barriers that we identified when talking to producers when we came up with our wool plan to begin with. Because again, we heard the same thing, that there were producers that couldn't get shearers, or there weren't enough shearers, or their shearers weren't up to snuff. So having a national structure, having a national standard in terms of testing, having the ability to access government funds, to connect to international work opportunities, all of these things go towards building kind of a more resilient infrastructure that for producers to be able to avail themselves of. I hope that covers what you were looking for.
Yeah, it does. There's just one more thing I'd like to add on there. You didn't quite touch on it. Would there be any, how do I put this? Any extra expectations to producers coming out of this? I know that's kind of a loaded question, but
Of course. Yeah. Well, we're very used to loaded questions. I think, yeah, I think part of, and this is something that, we've talked to both Alberta Lamb and Ontario Sheep about. I know both are working in this area at different levels, but I mean, producer education is important, and the sheer role in that is important, but as part of a broader kind of overall effort to develop a cohesive national standard for the wool that we produce and how it should be prepared and things like that. And a lot of it is chicken and egg, because there hasn't been an incentive for many producers to really take good care of their flock, or sorry, they do take good care of their flock, but in terms of taking good care of their clip, because frankly the prices have not been great. And they've only been getting kind of base level commodity prices for that. And so there really hasn't been there hasn't been that financial incentive. So, a lot of what we're doing is it's a lot of building the plane as we fly it, because we're trying to, certainly from a shearer's perspective, there's elements that they would want to be included in producer education of how you prepare the flock ahead of their arrival. But we're also in the wider picture, we're looking at, well, what state do the scours need that greasy wool in? What is kind of the maximum amount of VM that really is acceptable for the applications that we're looking at? How should it be packaged? We had, again, following on the heels of our carpet plan, we had one of our producer partners who used the model that plan outlined for outsourcing large scale scouring, because many of you know, scouring is another big hurdle that we face in terms of accessing especially high volume scouring. So they looked at outsourcing that and following the model that we created to outsource it to the UK as an example, because we were looking at a scour there that, to give you orders of magnitude, that has the ability to in 1 week process what all of Canada produces in a year. So they had sent a container over and to do that. But when the container arrived, there were all these surprise fees because of how the wool was packed. And it was mostly packed in sausage bags, but they hadn't properly communicated that what they required was square totes pressed with a hydraulic press, and that then the producer had to pay all this extra money because it took so much more time to unload these sausage bags. So again, being able to have one cohesive standard that has the input from shearers included, but also has the input from manufacturers, from scours, so that everyone's sort of singing from the same song sheet. So again, long story short, the answer is there's definitely a role for this plan in terms of feeding into producer education, but it's one part of a much wider effort that the Campaign for Wool and the Canadian Wool Council are looking at in terms of really preparing a standardized, an export standard for how Canadian wool should be prepared and transported. Does that cover your question?
yes, that's a great explanation. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Matthew?
Hello, this is Henry. I'm wondering what it actually looks like for a producer / shearer What's this program look like? What's the education? Where is it available? I'm down in southern Alberta. There's not a lot of shearers here, and the shearers that are available are mostly Hutterite colonies.
Right.
So I'm wondering what the education, what's available, and what it takes to get accredited.
Yeah, so the model that's been outlined in this plan, and again, nothing set in stone. It's just this is what the group came up with based on their discussions with groups across the country, as well as looking at what is done in other countries. So what has been mapped out is for shearers is a three-step kind of accreditation process, that there would be kind of a beginner, an intermediate, and an advanced standard that would be developed, and that would be with testing appropriate to that. So and this would be available to anyone who wants to take it, whether you're a producer who wants to shear your own flock, or for those who again are looking to make more of a career out of shearing. So yeah, the idea would be is that you would be trained by a competent accredited shearer, and that there would be sort of different milestones for each of those levels, and then testing to sort of to validate that after the fact. And then so part of the role of this organization would be to ensure that there would be training opportunities across the country. Again, just from a budgetary standpoint, I think the report looks at sort of rotating around the different levels in different parts of the country, so that people in different parts of the country can progress and follow that path, but also understanding that they have to pay for all of this, and want to be able to do it in a very economical way, so that there would be kind of Western centers and Eastern centers each year for doing it, but those locations would sort of move around to serve multiple communities. I guess in terms of accessing shearers, that's part of the plan as well, is that this organization would help to recruit more shearers into the fold, pardon the pun, but would also be responsible for connecting shearers across Canada to underserved markets like yours. And so again, the South African example is the one that really sticks out in my mind. I know the UK have also tackled this issue of kind of regional shortages of shearers. Of course, there it's much easier to get around. But I really latched on personally to the idea of what they did in South Africa, where you could, as a producer, look and see, who's available, who's willing to come to you, and then read their reviews, look at their availability, and be able to book right through kind of a central app that way. Again, that would be something that this group would have to take on, and as I say, they want to be able to do this right. So this isn't going to happen tomorrow, but we're looking at this being as something that would be up and running within the year, and that the programming would sort of grow over the next few years. But that's sort of the core of it, is providing these trading opportunities to shearers with accreditation testing. That there's would also be a stream for producers who separately want to develop their own knowledge around wool handling, and that sort of thing. But and that we would also be connecting both of those groups, as well as wool handling, and grading and all of that, which comes into it as well, of coming up with being able to put together lots that make sense for particular applications. And then this group would also be, would be the one to be driving recruitment in general nationally. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
It does. The only other thing, like locally here, if I had to go to Edmonton for accreditation, for example, I wouldn't be able to charge my customers that much more
Right.
to pay for that. It's kind of one of those things where around here, it's kind of a little bit of a hobby. There's a couple farms, 1,000 head plus. But then there's also the guys that have 3 and 20 and 40 and 100 here.
Yes.
It just, you can't justify charging these guys that much to get the accreditation.
Yeah, and that's why when we look at the plan, the rates are everything, the finances are all laid out there. I won't bore you with the details, but they're everything is designed to be very low barrier to entry. So we're looking at let's see if I will pull up at least one of the stats here around some of the pricing that was suggested. But yeah, like looking at for a couple $100 for oh yeah, here's the yeah, like a couple $100 for courses. So depending on what level, but really keeping everything very bare bones. And that's why, again, the structures, or at least what we propose, they may decide to go a different route, but again, we mostly opted for a structure that is would be volunteer run, maybe with some consultant staff helping on specific areas like accounting and things like that. But it doesn't imagine any full-time staff, precisely for that reason, to keep overheads really low, so that the cost of taking these courses is very doable for anyone, regardless of financial ability. I think there would also be an opportunity, again, once this is more formalized and set up, for government support around that as well. So even if those small fees are still a barrier for people, of looking at where you could get subsidies for skills training, because especially provincial governments, are very keen to fund skills training initiatives. So that could be an avenue for a national shearing organization to help keep that price really low for the consumer, to be able to get it sort of subsidized, because we also want to be, we want to be paying our skilled shearers who are going to be teaching and testing. We want to ensure that they're being paid adequately as well. But that could be another way of helping to keep a very low price point. But the plan does outline some ideas around that pricing, and so I encourage you to take a look at and see if that makes sense for you.
I will definitely read through that plan. I'm just asking some of the questions that, like, some of my local neighbors is Hutterick colonies. They've got about 15, 18 guys that can shear.
Yeah.
They're not gonna send all 15, 18 to school. And they're shearing a bunch of the neighbors, the 200-300 head like places. And they're not gonna send them to school. So what's it gonna take to get them into school?
I mean, I guess I would put that question back on you. Like, what do you think that it would take? I mean, it could be that, because I'm not, I know that they're a religious community, but I don't know fully all the details of what that life means for them. But as I say, for the status quo, for people who want to just keep doing what they're doing, the creation of this organization doesn't change that a lick. So if they want to continue to shear for their neighbors and not train or get additional training beyond what they've already received from the community, that's fine. Like, we don't, if any, the creation of this organization doesn't preclude that from happening. I think where it could be an incentive to them is to be able to access shearing training, especially for the higher levels, that would be above what's available in the community. So that could be, and maybe again, you can let me know if they would be open to that. That could be something of interest. It could also be that maybe some of the international opportunities might be of interest if they are able to travel, which I'm again, I'm unfamiliar. But maybe that could be again a way of training the trainer, basically. Like, one of them could get apprenticed by a global superstar in New Zealand and do a whole season down then, and then come back and then train the whole group. and raise the standard of the training in the community that way. We do one of the courses imagined in the plan is a teacher training course that would basically like train the trainer at the very highest level. So again, that might be of interest, but yeah, maybe you could let me know if if you think that those options would work, or if we'd have to have some sort of other outreach, or it could be that they're in the status quo group and they'll just continue to do what they do, and that's that. I don't know.
They're more than likely in the status quo group. They do not travel to like Australia, New Zealand. The farthest I know that they will go is like States for a weekend type deal.
Right.
They do try to, higher learning, but it all has to be home tonight type deal. They don't leave the colony and live somewhere else for a certain amount of time. But I'm just thinking something like farm days or whatever, where somebody would train, or a trainer would go to a farm, because like when they're shearing, they got 10-12 guys on a shearing stand,
Right. Wow.
and they knock out a pile of sheep in a hurry.
Mhm.
And that's where, for them to go somewhere, it doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah, well, and I guess with that kind of critical mass, it might make sense to just again run the session in cooperation with the colony, send the trainer to them. I mean, if you've got that number of people, I mean, that's probably going to be bigger than most of the classes elsewhere. Because realistically, we're looking at, for these courses, you're looking at only probably a couple people at a time that you would be working with. So that it could very well be that would be worth their while to be able to have someone go directly to them to upskill that group.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, go.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
I actually, it's just kind of a comment. Thinking about the colonies got me thinking about this. You had mentioned earlier about the Alberta's fine wool breeds in production. I think an interesting point of that is that the Hutterite colonies tend to have a lot of those fine wool breeds.
Mhm.
So that might be a foot in the door if you're really wanting to, amp up production or really do some targeting. Getting the colonies involved is going to be very, very important. So, and I also agree with that. Sending someone in to do some day training would be much more effective. But because some of these Hutterite shearers do go around and help their community, small flocks or whatever like that, shear their sheep, that really could be a good way of helping to set the standard in small areas, and kind of doing better close to home and then growing outwards as well.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I think, as you say, I mean, it could be that those end up being some of our bigger classes, because as Henry mentioned, if you've got 12, 18 people, that's probably going to be some of the biggest sessions that this organization would train. So it could be, a real win-win there, and get access to that supply of fine wool. Because I have, we did a project a couple of years ago in collaboration with a Canadian designer, Smythe, and Holt Renfrew, and we produced a 100-mile blazer here in Toronto, where all aspects of that blazer were within 100 miles of the city of Toronto. And what it showed us, I mean, it was a demonstration project, so there was a lot of expense that went into setting it up. But what it validated was that even though writ large Canadian wool isn't usually suitable for fashion, it tends to lean more towards the interior side in terms of the bulk of what we produce as application. But with that Alberta fine wool, there is no shortage of demand for kind of a traceable Canadian fiber. And that 100-mile blazer sold out in 2 days, as an example. So, you know, we gave it a good publicity run. So, you know, we got it in the Globe and Mail and got all kinds of people talking about it beforehand, which helped to drive that. But it showed that the appetite is there. So the challenge is, of course, is building a supply chain that's going to be able to produce a product that's going to be at a price point that's going to make sense, even for a high-end customer. Because again, there's limits, and you know, even those who spend quite a lot of money on clothes, again, for especially for like a domestic designer, there's sort of a ceiling that they'll sort of accept, and some other partners we've worked with haven't understood that. So the challenge is always, how do you get the quality and the quantity that's going to make it worthwhile. But yeah, I think that's a great idea. It'd be kind of a dual purpose, because being able to access that pool of fine fiber, as well as ensuring that it's, you know, harvested at the high, you know, to the highest levels of quality. And there's challenges specifically with harvesting fine wool fleece as well, that again that we could be incorporating into the curriculum. Any other questions?
Are you guys partnering with the Canadian wool growers or working with them?
Not at the moment. So we worked with wool growers for our first, let's see, I have to do the math. The first 6 years that we were in operation. And so they were one of our founding partners. Their now former general manager was the chair of our vice chair of our advisory council. And we've gone to them, you know, and they financially supported us at the very start. Later on, you know, again, we mostly got support elsewhere, but we still had them as an operational partner. We haven't worked as closely with them in the last couple of years, because we came to them with a proposal that was 2/3 funded for work around branding, some of the economic, the export mapping that I talk about, the international work. And it wasn't something that was of interest to them at that time, but we like to keep the lines of communication open. And so again, would love to be able to either integrate this in their wider work, or have them on as a partner. But they're not currently involved in this specific project. But again, we always look for ways that we can work with wool growers. I guess one of the challenges is that most of their strategic focus over the last few years seems to be more on the retail and feed store side of the business. The wool side hasn't got as much investment, but we're hoping but that has changed. They have been started to put some money into an innovation prize. So that was a good first step, because when we first had them involved in our strategic planning process, they weren't spending anything on research and development at that time. So they are starting to move a little bit in the right direction. But I would say, again, writ large, their strategic focus seems to be more on the retail side of their operation. But we would love to get them involved with this. I think, again, one of the learnings from developing the shearing plan is that, again, you don't want too many cooks, because you've already got a lot in terms of the shearers themselves. But I think long term, absolutely, and regardless, even if they're not directly involved in the administration, wool growers needs to be feeding in information in terms of both on the producer education side, but also in terms of what they need from shearers in order to get kind of the best price, and what shearers should be, how they should be preparing the fleeces and so forth, in order to maximize you know, what wool growers needs in order to sell it on the global commodities market. So yeah, long story short, not at the moment, but our door is always open, and we've worked with them in the past, and we hope to work with them in the future.
So are they still basically the main market for most wool producers?
I would say, yeah, they seem to be the one of the larger buyers. It's really difficult. The stats are this is another challenge that our national policy committee is looking at, because the stats are pretty unreliable, because yeah, they are certainly big, and if probably the biggest, but a lot of producers, and we hear this again and again in our calls, don't send in to wool growers anymore. So it's hard to get an accurate picture on the full wool supply. But yeah, but I would say it's probably safe to say in terms of volume that they're the biggest. The challenge is that the majority of most of what they're selling is just going for the global commodities market for whatever the price is at the time, and that hasn't been very much money for a long time. So I know that's engendered a lot of frustration with producers. Also, I've heard some complaints about the timing of payments. It used to be you got paid up front, and that doesn't happen anymore. But I guess where our approach has differed is that we've been trying to develop full product value chains that allow us to work with the manufacturer, the producer, the retailer, and design a product kind of backwards, so that we can build in a premium price well above what wool growers would provide, usually in terms of commodities prices, to the producer. And that's been a focus of both our the carpet plan, which is already out, as well as the upholstery plan, is because there's always been money to be made in wool. The challenge is sort of equalizing where that profit gets spread a little bit, and usually a bulk of the profit is at sort of the end, is when it's sold, and that's taken by the retailer. So being able to design products like our Canadian wool carpets that we've created, where we're building in a premium price to the producer. The last batch, again, we were at $1.50 a kilo, but we were looking again how we could get that up. But being able to design that from the outset, that's where our approach has differed a little bit. But again, to answer your question, I think the bulk of Canadian wool, which is, at least according to the stats we have, it's about 90% that's going through them, and then of that, the majority of that is going to China and India, where it's used for blending. So again, where we're trying to change that a bit is kind of create products where 100% Canadian wool is a key part of the marketing and the design of that product. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
And just being aware of timing, we are at 7:01. So I don't know, Matthew, if you had some final thoughts, just to be respectful of participants' time this evening.
Definitely, and it is certainly later out east than it is where you are. So I also don't want to keep people waiting. But well, first of all, I just wanted to thank you, Ashley, and Alberta Lamb, for your support of this work. It's very important, and again, I thank you for your leadership in terms of looking for opportunities for your members. I mentioned at the beginning that we have opportunities to get involved in some of the international work that we're doing. I would ask, we've got several different working groups of the International Wool Textile Organization, where we have the opportunity to nominate Canadians. So if there's, and those cover a bunch of different areas: animal welfare, biosecurity, market intelligence, health and wellness, wool interiors, which is actually a group that's chaired by a Canadian. So if there is any of the producers on this call, or if you have colleagues who want to be involved in this work, please get in touch with us. We would love to be able to connect you with an opportunity there. We want to have more Alberta and other Canadian producers on these groups, particularly in the animal welfare and the biosecurity areas. So if that's of interest, please do get in touch. But thank you again to Alberta Lamb for your support and for the opportunity to share our work. And I encourage all your members, if they have questions or comments, to reach out to us at any time. We're always happy to engage with producers.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We do appreciate your time coming in and presenting to our producers so that they are kept in the loop as well about what's been happening with the campaign for wool. And I'd also like to thank our participants who joined us this evening. This will conclude the webinar tonight. I will be sending out, it'll probably be towards the end of next week, the recording for tonight's session, as well as posting it on our YouTube channel, Sheep Central Alberta.